Mustang-based GT350 will compete against the E-Type Jags, the Sunbeam Tigers, and Corvettes.
So after a real successful 1965 season, both in racing and car sales, Ford decides to extend Shelby's contract to keep building Shelby Mustangs. So for '66, they look at all of the reviews they're getting back from the customers. They're also looking at what costs money and what becomes very efficient. They also know that if they're gonna come out of the box running in '66, they have to have cars in September, October. Problem is, the Ford plant gets shut down over the summer. So what Ford has to do is they have to get a bunch of cars to Shelby before the plant shuts down so they can start producing '66 Shelbys. That's how the whole 65 and a half, or the leftover cars, carryover cars, whatever you want to call them, that's how they came about. 252 1965 Mustangs were shipped to Shelby to be turned into '66 Shelbys. Here are the differences. Some are subtle and others not so much. So basically, the Wimbledon White Mustang 65 Hypo gets sent to Shelby. So the motor, it's still black. As you know, in '66, all Ford motors on Mustangs turn blue, but because these were actually '65 Mustangs, the blocks were black. So the noticeable changes, the big changes on a '66 that you'll see is obviously the addition of the side scoop, supposedly functional, even though it just blows air on the tires, not really on the brakes, and the side window in the back here instead of the 5 vents of the traditional '65 and the regular Mustang. Those are the big cosmetic differences. The hood looks basically the same, but it's a steel frame fiberglass hood in 1966 as opposed to fiberglass with the port on the early cars. As far as the wheels go, they're still 1965 Kragers. For the first 252 cars, you could get the steel wheel like the original '65s, or you could get the Kragers. After that, they went to the 14-inch wheel. They went to the 14-inch steel wheel, which very few cars got. They got the painted Magnum, and they also got the chrome Magnums, and later the 10 spokes. The reason they went to 14 inches, you can see here, the 15-inch, they had lots of complaints of it rubbing against the fenders. It was a common problem, so they said, let's get rid of that. So it's the early cars that had the Kragers on them. So as far as performance goes, they kept all the cool stuff from a '65. They kept the tri-Y headers, they lowered the front control arms. You can see where they put those. They had the heavier springs, they had the bigger sway bar. They had all the neat stuff that made the '65 a '65. They still had the rear end. They had the override track bars, which were very expensive to put in. When you think about it, you had to take out the interior, you had to hack holes into the floor, and trust me, they hacked the holes into the floor. They moved the stoppers, they cut them off literally with a torch, moved them to the inside, put the bumpers there. They had the limiting cables. They still had all the cool stuff as far as suspension and brakes and handling went. Same with the pitman arm and the idler arm from a '65. You kind of got the best of both worlds because you got the look of a new car, you got the performance of the old car, which was better. In the later cars, you also got the options of different colors. Now, the first 252 cars, they were all white because again, they were really '65 leftover cars with a '65 Mustang serial number. So they were all white. The blue stripes were added just like they were on the original cars. So let's have a look at the interior, what the differences are there. So the interiors are a little different than a '65. The '65s had the fiberglass pod. They had the tack and the oil pressure gauge, but it was fiberglass and it was kind of, it didn't hold up well in the heat. Plus it was a pain in the ass because they literally had to cut the dash out to get that pod in there. So they went to just a dash mount tack. The early cars had the Cobra on top, the later cars had it on bottom. It was a 9,000 RPM tack. Like I said, the instrument part was kind of from a GT. The radio was an option. The door panels are '65, the seats are '65. The steering wheel, because the wood wheel was relatively expensive, they just went to a Mustang wheel and put the GT350 cap on it. As far as the back, well, '65s never had a back seat. Remember, in order to go racing and meet homologation regulations, it had to be a two-seater for B production. By 66, they didn't really care anymore. There were no factory team cars out there running. So the back seat became optional. Now, some cars still had a parcel tray. It was a little bit different, no rear seat for weight. It was a little different in the sense of the look of it, but same basic idea. The interior also had these side windows and had these inserts. So they did have to cut away some of the metal in here and put in these fiberglass inserts that never fit very well. You can see they're a little wompy and bumpy, and they're a real pain in the ass to get into these cars and get them to look semi-half decent. Like I said, we went over the exterior differences. The grille is obviously a 66 grille. When these cars were shipped though, to Shelby, they still had the 65 grills in. That was something else Shelby had to change. The rest of the car really does look like a 66 Mustang, and obviously after the first 252 cars were completed, they really were 66 Mustangs that were converted. All of those running changes didn't just happen on car 253. They slowly got rid of their excess inventory. The overriders slowly became underriders because they were way cheaper to put in, easier to deal with, and didn't make as much noise. The no-spin rear ends became more civilized and more drivable. As far as the wheels go, like I said, you didn't have the tire rubbing anymore with the 14-inch, and you had a variety of options. You had Magnums painted, you had chrome Magnums, especially on the Hertz cars, you had the 10 spokes, and on the early cars, you had the 15-inch Kragers. Same thing with performance. On the early cars, you had the 715 Hollies. Later, you had the auto lights. But again, that was a running transition change as they ran out of carburetors. Same thing with the intake and valve covers. As they started running out of the stuff they had in stock, the valve covers went to wrinkle finish black. The conies slowly faded away into auto light shocks. They just became a more civilized, easier car to build, little cheaper, little more refined, with a lot more options in the way of colors, rear seats, automatic transmissions, as opposed to 4-speed only in 65, and the first 252 were 4-speed only as well. So they're really a 65 with some cool 66 stuff on it. The back end treatment was a little different. You now had the GT350 gas cap, you still had the GT350 emblem, and you had exhaust that came all the way out the back. The original exhaust on a 65 came in front of the wheels. It had basically very little in the way of mufflers. It was loud and a little obnoxious. And matter of fact, throughout 65, some states were getting complaints that the exhaust was too loud, and some of those cars that were going to those states at 65 also got a full exhaust coming out to the rear. Either way, there's still a great sounding car. I let Gary take this for a drive to see what he thought of an early 66 car.
All right, let's take this thing for a drive. Let out the clutch, just a nice smooth clutch. Just your hands around this wheel put a smile on your face. You know, every time you get in one of these cars from the 60s, it takes a minute to remember that the brakes aren't brand new. Transmission is beautiful, car shifts beautifully, does everything you ask of it. And there's nothing like that view that I have right now. You know, the steering wheel, the tack, out over the hood, the stripes, the hood pins. Oh yeah, that's a GT350. Of course, a nice tall 389 gear. You know, I think the perfect gear for this car to drive on the street and to really kind of get after it sometimes. the car goes really well. It's a lightweight car, 289, but I'd say where the fun really is in how well this thing corners. Great Coney shocks, like I was saying, the best you could get in the time. These cars were set up well from that homologation where, you know, they could either homologate the cars with the suspension, with the race suspension, or the race engine. Shelby and Ford decided to go with the race suspension. One, because it was way easier to warranty race suspension than having every car have a warranty with race engines of the time. So, you know, although the average guy buying a 65, or like this car, 66 or 65 carryover car, 66, probably would have liked to have a race engine. It just wasn't going to happen. But all the fun in my mind is in the cornering, in these, in how well this thing is set up. I guess really the only downside for the carryover cars, in my mind, compared to the 65, is the rear exhaust. It just doesn't sound as good as that side exhaust. But I guess they were getting so many complaints out of states like New York and California, where guys were getting pulled over, that they had to go to the rear exhaust for 66. Okay, I guess the other downside is the steering wheel. You know, still a great looking, great feeling steering wheel, but it's the faux wood, not the real wood. But, you know, I think you get the better looking tack. I love the tack on the 66s. Obviously the rear windows look great and the scoops look great. But as far as driving goes, I mean, this car is restored to the nth degree. The car is perfect, completely sorted, doesn't wander at all. Steering is exactly how you'd expect it. Engine runs perfectly, beautifully tuned. I mean, you look out over the hood and you can almost see your reflection in it. And these cars are lightweight little cars with a lot of snot. They really get up and go. Get our foot over to the brake. Little blip on the downshift. No power steering. A little bit of a chore to turn around, but once you're going, it doesn't matter. And you do have a nice big steering wheel on here with a whole ton of grip. Nice. Oh yeah. The car pulls hard. Another one of those cars that you can't help but smile when you're driving this thing. Especially through the corners. I can't believe how well it handles. Oh yeah. Let's go. I always say with this car, it's the best of both worlds for so many reasons. Another reason is you get the rear seats if you need to throw your kids in the back. And then, again, as a street car, if you're gonna actually drive one of these things, and especially if you bought one back in the day and you really were gonna drive it long periods of time, the side pipes would have been a little bit loud and may have gotten old on a long cruise. This car still sounds really good, but your ears aren't gonna be ringing after a long drive up to the cottage or something like that. I'd say that was a successful drive. My books anyways. That was a nice little afternoon cruise. You know, these cars, in my mind, is really the best of both worlds. Kind of all the performance of the 65, and then that, you know, better look of the scoop and the window on the 66. Very cool car that some guys really don't know what they are, and they kind of need explaining, and it's a cool story to be able to tell. So after the drive, we've got to ask ourselves, do you need a car like this? No. No one needs a GT350 at all. But do you want a car like this? Oh yeah. Yeah, you want a perfectly restored, jewelry quality, absolutely flawless driver, Carryover GT350? Yeah. Oh yeah, you want one.
All in all, they were a great success. Almost 2,466 Shelbys were built, but the first 252, the carryovers, the leftovers, the 65.5s, whatever you want to call them, are by far, in my mind, the coolest and most valuable of 66 Shelbys.